I want to acknowledge the elder and the teachings that you offered us this morning. Anashik, that's thank you in my language. And there's a lot of wisdom in this room. I know that, there's lots of folks here who've been doing this work for a long time, and I appreciate that there's lots of knowledge in the room. What I'm going to do today is, it really is, you think about it as my timeline story or my timeline lecture. I was born in Sarnia, Ontario, or Hamilton, but grew up in Sarnia. And when I went to school, I didn't really have access to any content about Indigenous people. But it was always, very much it was a part of my life, but almost like a part that there's a lot about it that I didn't understand. And I had a lot of questions. But really, I think, as a young adult and making a life, I kind of buried those questions. And it wasn't until later, when I was an elementary school teacher. I taught elementary school for 10 years, grade 1 and grade 2, and I did some special ed and ESL. I used to see when the junior teachers were doing their People of Native Ancestry units of study. Some of you maybe remember those units. And that, they were great units, right? Because you could divide your class into groups, and one group would do the people of the plains, and somebody would do the people of the woodlands, and someone would do the people of the north, and you'd have these little groups, right? Somebody would look at the clothing, somebody would do the research about were they hunters or gatherers. There was lots of hands-on activities, and as educators, we kind of like those units of study. But when I was taking my grade 1s to the library, I'd see the little villages out of the teepees and the longhouses out of popsicle sticks. And, I was watching from my perspective as an First Nations person and an educator, and I was really struck and thought, gee, this is how we taught about Indigenous people when I was in school, and we're doing the same thing. And, I was sad. I would walk by the lobby, and that totem pole out of cardboard boxes would be there. And, the stories on the wall about how, the legends and how the beaver god is flat tail. And, I used to really be a little irritated and think, there's more to being First Nations, Métis or Inuit than these representations. Then my son was in grade 4, and he did his first People of Native Ancestry unit of study. And I was then that I said, wait a minute. As an educator, I have a responsibility. We need to do more. We need to think about what we're teaching and what we're not teaching. I was certainly thinking about what we were teaching and not teaching. So I left my teaching position, and I went back to grad school to understand, to try to understand why were we continuing to reproduce these stories, and why was it that I, as a First Nations person, had so many questions? And one of the first things that I did was look at, okay, how do I understand this history, right? So, well, here we are today in 2017. And I was thinking, about those units of study and what we were teaching. I was thinking about, this time as from time immemorial, right? From time immemorial, our people lived on this land. And yet, what I was seeing in the curriculum was this representation, like you said, that really focused on, the physical characteristics of Indigenous people. So, what was their shelter? Were they hunters or gatherers? How did they travel? And I thought about this, It's like, this is like a view of Indigenous people through Western anthropology. Right? The anthropologists came to our communities and they did their notes, they observed us and made notes, and they thought they could know everything about us based simply on what they could see. And then what I thought about was, what are they missing? What's missing? And, you know, those stories that we wrote, that we had our kids like think that they could write a story, Indigenous knowledge, our stories are our knowledge, right? And yet we teach them as if they're, you know, myths and legends that a 7-year-old could write. That's not respectful of our knowledge. Our spiritual practices. We taught very little, right? All of our emphasis was on what people could see, and we weren't thinking and teaching about the knowledge about our spirituality, our spiritual practices, our systems of government. These things were missing from what we taught in those units of study that really focused on the past. And, you know, I knew, like in contemporary times, I knew what was missing. I understood what the challenges were in our reserve communities, right, in contemporary times. The housing shortage, the lack of clean water, the lack of employment, a lot of the pressures that families were experiencing. I was aware of these challenges, right? They were part of my lived experience, and I saw what we were teaching, you know, in school, but how did we go from this time when we were living according to our knowledge and we had our own spiritual practices and our own systems of government, what happened in between? And that was the question that I really wanted to understand. What happened in between, and why is it that we don't teach it, right? So I went, and one of the first projects I did at grad school was to look at history textbooks, right? And so if you look at the textbooks, and I was, you know, studying in the early 90s, and I looked at the texts, and certainly if you look at those books, and again, as educators, we know these lessons are fairly familiar, right? We talk about the explorers, right? There's the Aboriginal People and Explorers unit of study, and we talk about the fur trade. So Aboriginal people and pioneers, that's a unit of study. So we talk about explorers, we talk about the fur trade, we talk about missionaries, right? But when I looked at the textbooks, again, I started to see what it was that was missing in the stories that we tell about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And my focus today is very much on the First Nations experience because that's my experience. But I have done some work with Inuit educators, and there are so many similarities. The timing is different, right? But when we talk about how the fur trade impacted in First Nations communities, but like the whaling industry had similar impacts for the Inuit. So there are parallels. It's not exactly the same. There are different time periods, but the impacts are the same. And thinking about impacts, right? Well, we talk about explorers, fur traders, and missionaries. When I look at the curriculum documents and the history textbooks, what I found was we weren't talking or teaching enough, or even understanding ourselves, the impact of disease, the impact of automatic weapons, right? Prior to contact, First Nations people, we had our own territories. And of course we had battles over territory, but we didn't have automatic weapons. So the introduction of automatic weapons had a profound impact, as did disease. And while we talk about the missionaries, we don't really teach enough about the impact that Christianity had and the way that disease, weapons, and Christianity work together to impact our communities, right? Disease really devastated our population, and our communities were under incredible stress, right? And then that's when the missionaries were coming into the communities and preaching Christianity, and that disrupted our spiritual practices. Some community members converted to Christianity and some didn't. But think about the impact that has on our strength as a community, because it divides us. So we have our children and our elders are dying from the introduction of disease, and then we have Christianity dividing us, and the fur trade really introduced capitalism, really disrupting the traditional practices, the traditional ways of sharing within the community and people being in relationship with the land and each other. So, but when we think about what we teach, right, we haven't in the past taught enough about how the contact with the newcomers impacted the strength in our communities. And like I said, you have to really think about how these impacts operated in relationship to each other. So, and how that really devastated communities and really attacked the strength within our communities, right? And then certainly after like the period of contact, then we have increased settlement happening, right? Because people wanted to come left Europe and came to these lands because they really, the stories of land being available. And there was a land shortage in Britain, in England and Europe. And so people were leaving and coming to these lands, right? And so the strength of the newcomer nations was increasing as our nations were under attack, right? So this is about power, and this is about how power shifted on these lands. And there's the key word, right? Land. Because as settlement increased and our communities were under stress and our traditional ways of taking care of ourselves and supporting our communities, right? The desire for land, that became like key to the relationship. And it's land and resources, right? Think about our nation, right? The Canadian state. Our wealth as a nation really comes from the resources of the land, right? Mining, fishing, forestry, these are key sources of financial wealth. And that's what really the relationship became very much focused on land and who had control of the land, right? So as the shift in power is happening, this is when those treaties, right? And we can't emphasize enough the importance of the treaty relationships, because as our communities were under stress and settlement was increasing and this who's going to control the land, treaties became key to the relationship. And the first treaty that was signed on Turtle Island in the Americas, right, is what we affectionately refer to as the 2-row. And these wampum belts were made with beads, purple and white beads. And this treaty belt is called Gaswentha, or the 2-row. And what this represents is peaceful coexistence, right? The Indigenous people would travel the river of life in our canoe on our side of the river, and the newcomers would travel the river of life in their ship on their side of the river. So the relationship was meant to be based on peaceful coexistence. We wouldn't interfere in each other's lives, right? Of course, that's not what happened, right? Because the relationship really was about land and wealth, right? Land and resources. So one of the stories that really helped me to understand how this shift happened was the story of Mississauga and the Cree, the people of the plains. The Cree, they relied on the buffalo, right? They had a spiritual, I probably actually still have a spiritual relationship with the buffalo. And their food, their clothing, their shelter, their utensils, everything, their entire lives were linked with the buffalo. And they relied on the buffalo to sustain their life. Well, what happened to the buffalo? Well, in the US, the Americans built a railroad across the southern states quite early, and hunters came on those railroads, and they came, right, go back to capitalism. They came because buffalo hide robes were very valuable in Europe at the time. Right? Buffalo hide hats and coats and blankets. They were worth a lot of money. And how many of you, if I said go home and look in your china cabinets, have bone china in your cabinets, or your mothers or grandmothers have it? That bone china was made from buffalo bones. You've got buffalo bone china in your cabinet. The buffalo were slaughtered, right, for their bones and their hides, and their carcasses were left on the plains to rot. So this put incredible pressure on all of the people of the plains, right, because they didn't, when the buffalo herds were slaughtered, then they had no way to sustain themselves. They had no food. They couldn't build their shelters. They had no utensils and clothing. They were starving, and they had no way to shelter themselves. This is an interesting piece about this story. If you go back and you look at the history books, we talk about the First Nations people. There's so many times I would read those books and I would see the word wanderers, nomadic. It drove me crazy. The Cree, they didn't wander aimlessly, right? They followed the buffalo herds. They lived on the prairies in the summer, right? Hunting the buffalo. And then the winters, they would go north into the woods, into the forests. The Oji Cree, right? Their territories are together, and they would go together and find shelter in those northern forests. But when the buffalo herds were decimated, they couldn't protect themselves. They had no way of sheltering themselves. This is when the state sent their agents out to meet with the bands. And they said, oh, if you sign a treaty, right? This is when the Canadians wanted to build a railroad. So they said, if you sign a treaty, then, and give up your territories, then we will provide you with, right, this is what the treaties were about. We'll provide you with homes and education and healthcare. There's in the numbered treaties on the plains, there's something called the medicine chest clause, and it is about the provision of healthcare, right? So homes, education, healthcare, and transition to a farming way of life, right? A way of sustaining life, right? You can't live by the buffalo anymore. If you sign a treaty and move to a reserve, then we will provide, right? Homes, education, healthcare, and instruction in farming and support in transition, so the buying of machinery and seed to become farmers, right? To transition to the ways of life of the settler population, right? See, the interesting thing about this when I did my research is when these reserves were created in 2017, there weren't supposed to be reserves anymore, right? The thinking at the time was that Indigenous people would be removed to the reserves, and then with the provision of these, treaty rights, what would happen is that Indigenous people would either die off, or they would assimilate. So that was the thinking behind the creation of the reserve system. We weren't ever supposed to have reserves in 2017, right? We were supposed to assimilate. That was the plan, right? That Indigenous people would die off or assimilate, and that this was supposed to be temporary, right? That's not what happened, right? We know that's not what happened. But why? Why didn't it happen? Well, the thing about the reserve system is it's incredibly oppressive. But on the other hand, the reserve, it brought us together, right? We lived close together in relationship with each other. And, as the elder said this morning, our ancestors protected language, they protected ceremony, they protected our knowledge, right? And like my grandfather, late at night with his friends singing in the language, they sometimes had to go into hiding, right, to protect the knowledge. But that's what the reserve system allowed us to do. So on the one hand, it's really oppressive, but on the other hand, because we were living close together, we were able to take some steps to protect ourselves and our language. So it's this really odd kind of situation where the reserves can be incredibly challenging places to live, but at the same time, it's home. Right? It's home where our families and our stories and our language and our ceremonies are practiced. So it's this strange, the reserve system is a strange creation of this way of living that isolates us and is both harmful but also protective. And there's a desire to stay and a desire to leave both at the same time. But this policy of this plan that we would assimilate, right? There's the reserve system, and the treaties were signed, but the state fairly quickly realized that they had to have a system of laws to govern what was happening on the reserves. And that's led to the creation of the Indian Act, right? This is a piece of legislation that is a series of laws that apply only to First Nations people, right? And the laws are like they control every detail of life on the reserve, right? It has laws that affect home, access to housing, education, healthcare, and how life is going to be sustained on the reserves. But the other thing that we don't necessarily know about the Indian Act is that the goal of the Indian Act was assimilation. Interesting though, a lot of us know stories of assimilation from our own experiences, but when it comes to Indigenous people, we weren't, it wasn't enough, the state wasn't happy for, to just leave it to, well, Indigenous people will choose to assimilate. No, they made it a policy of forced assimilation. And that's what the Indian Act supported. Forced assimilation. So some of you probably know some of the laws that were in practice, but did you know that before the 1950s, if you got a university degree, then you lost your status, you lost your treaty rights. Right? When we say we lose our status, it means we lose our treaty rights. So if you got a university degree, you lost your treaty rights. What does that mean? It means you can't access housing in your community. You have no right any longer because the state is not providing housing for you because you're not status anymore. So you can't access health care, you can't access education, you can't access any of these rights. You don't even have the right to live in your community. So I know lots of folks know about the law of if you're a status First Nations woman and you marry white, then it used to be that you lost your status. And think about it, right? You marry white, you can't live at home with your extended family, your community. What if that marriage goes wrong? What if there's violence in that relationship? You can't go home because you don't have access to housing anymore on the reserve, right? Lots of women didn't even know that when they married white that they were going to lose their status and what the loss of status meant. If you joined the army, you lost your status, right? All of these things were signs that you were assimilating. So you lost your status, with the goal being reducing the numbers of people within the reserve system. So the Indian Act is an incredibly oppressive piece of legislation. It's been changed, in a number of times, so you don't lose your status anymore in those ways. It's still a complicated story, but so these stories are all a part of the history of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on these lands. And I, as an educator, when I looked at what we were teaching and what we weren't teaching, these are the stories that I wanted to understand. And the more that I looked, the more that I came to understand how it was that the reserve system is as it is, like this policy of forced assimilation and these laws that govern us on the reserve and the pressure to assimilate. But, I learned about the Indian Act. Also, there was a provision for the state to assign an Indian agent. Right? How are they going to know if communities were actually assimilating? Well, they assigned an Indian agent to each reserve community. And it was his job, and I say his because it was, mainly white men who had the power on the reserve to decide who had access, who was going to get what house, who was going to get funding. My mom used to tell me about how her mother would have to go and knock on the door of the Indian agent and ask for funds to buy them shoes. The relationship was, the Indian agents had the power to decide how the funds were going to be spent. So there's so much control there. The Indian agents, they also had the responsibility of reporting to the state. And they had to write a report at the end of each session of government. There's what's called, the state calls the sessional papers, and they're reports from each of the ministries, right? And so Indian Affairs wanted to know, how was the policy of forced assimilation happening? How was there progress being made? So the Indian agents would write, these are detailed records. I looked at the ones for Moraviantown, and they're so detailed. They'll tell me, like, in 1937, how many, not just how many children were going to school on the reserve, but how many boys were in grade 3, and how many girls were in grade 3, and how many kids had tonsillitis, and how many families were going to church, and how many families were successfully farming, right? It was all about the assimilation. The Indian agents reported to the state, right? And in a lot of reserve communities, there were schools, right? The missionaries had set up schools. And the Indian agents reported that, well, there are schools on the reserves and the kids are going, but the problem is that when kids go home from school, their parents are still teaching them the language, they're teaching them their ceremonies, if we really want to accomplish the policy of forced assimilation, we need to get the kids, and we need to get the kids away from their parents, because their parents are still teaching them what it means to be Lenape or Potawatomi or Cree, right? Or Haudenosaunee. So we've got to get the kids away, and that is, of course, what led to the creation of the residential school system. It was about this policy of forced assimilation and about getting the kids away from their families so that to support the assimilation, right? And the attack on our culture and our language. And really, again, it was an attack on the health and well-being in our communities. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done a tremendous amount of work in raising our awareness and our knowledge about the impact that the residential schools had on our communities, right? Again, when you look at this time, right, this was also a time when, remember those anthropologists, right? They were actually allowed to go into our communities and steal all of our sacred items, right? And you think about going back over here to the knowledge and the spiritual practices, right? Anthropologists would go in with the RCMP and they would take all of our sacred items, masks, rattles, drums. Think about those museums that you visit, right? The museum in Hull, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Anthropology Museum in BC. You look in those museums and those are our sacred items that were taken, forcibly taken from our communities to support the assimilation of Indigenous people, so that if we didn't have our items, then we couldn't practice our ceremonies, right? So this is the kind of pressure that was put on our communities, right? To really understand what happened, have to think about how at every level our communities were under attack, the education of our children, our spiritual practices, our systems of governing ourselves, right? The Indian Act introduced the band system. That wasn't our way of governing ourselves, elected band councils and elected chiefs. That's not how we traditionally governed ourselves. We had our own systems of governing ourselves, but they were replaced. Right? This was all about the forced assimilation, right? So that the reserves would only be temporary and Indigenous people wouldn't exist anymore. So what happened, right? Here I'm still stuck with that question, because, in 2017, I see, the reserves are there, and yes, there's a lot of challenges, but I also see the strength in our communities and our leaders. And then I think again, well, what happened? Interestingly enough, World War I and World War II had a profound impact on our communities because Indigenous people signed up, to fight on behalf of the state. We have a warrior tradition in many of that's a part of our knowledge system. And so our men and women signed up and they fought in the war. And this is actually when my mom lost her status initially, was when my grandfather joined the army. He fought in World War II, but when he joined, he lost his status. So when he came back from the war, like many, of our people, didn't know that it meant that he couldn't live on the reserve anymore. He went with his family back to the reserve to live. They lived with my grandmother for a few years, but it was too crowded. The house was too small. There were too many children. They left the reserve and settled in Hamilton. So that story is a common story, right? People couldn't go back to the reserve. They found themselves in the cities, and they started political organizations, right? Initially the late 40s and 50s was really people just getting started. But in the 1960s, right, there was the rise of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the women's movement, and Red Power started at that time as well, right? Really initially in the 50s and then really grew in the 60s. And the National Indian Brotherhood was formed at this time. And they started initially in BC around fishing rights, but when the organization became national and they took on, right, the fight for Indigenous rights, because they had fought on behalf of the state. Yet when they came back, they continued to be treated like second-class citizens. They didn't have, the rights in the cities because they were still, like my mom said, we left the reserve, but, we were still Native, right? So they didn't have access to their full rights because they were still treated. The discrimination at the time was really overwhelming. Mom talked about, going to look for a job and, signs in the window, no Indians allowed, being called a dirty squaw and told to get out. That was a part of her experience. But the National Indian Brotherhood formed at this time to take on the fight for our treaty rights. And the first thing the National Indian Brotherhood did, first issue they took on, right? We knew that our health and well-being, right, if we wanted our strength and health and well-being as communities to get it back, we had to get control of education, right? We had to control education of our children. And this was the first issue that the Brotherhood took on. And in 1970, they presented the government with a policy paper called Indian Control of Indian Education. And that policy paper was accepted by the Canadian state in 1972. And that's really, for me, that's like, we're all here today because of that work, right? That original policy paper has it has informed education policy of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children since it was accepted in 1972. Now, there's an incredible amount of work to do, though, right? Because our communities, right, we were still sort of recuperating from the residential schools. And in some communities, the residential schools were still very much in practice. But, you know, our communities had to recuperate. We needed teachers, we needed policymakers, we need to have access to curriculum. We needed a curriculum that, you know, was appropriate for our communities. And initially, funding was still tied to the use of provincial curriculum. So there is a lot of work to be done. But this is when the education control by Indigenous people really started with this policy paper. But one of the other things that was really important in terms of the relationship was the 1969 white paper, right? The policy papers, they're called white papers, but the 69 policy paper, the then government, it was the first Trudeau government, and Jean Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs. And, you know, Trudeau, he said to him, you know, like, why do we have an Indian Act? Why do we have status and non-status people? And all Canadians should be the same. This Indian Act, it's, you know, ancient and it's oppressive and we should get rid of it. And so the 69 white paper suggested that the Indian Act be abolished and status be abolished. And again, it had a profound impact in our communities because, you know, our leaders said, wait a minute, like, yes, this is the most oppressive piece of legislation, but you cannot simply sign a paper and erase this entire history, right? If you get the Indian Act is oppressive, but it's the only piece of legislation that we have that protects our treaty rights. So you can't just say, oh, everyone's going to be the same and erase the history, right? We have to pay attention. We have to learn. We have to engage with this history and understand how can we work together to create new and better relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. How do we do that? What should the relationship, what's the relationship that we want with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, right? And, you know, our leaders, you know, there was a lot of this political organizing, but that has gone on. And people are working in healthcare and in the judicial system and in policing and education and politics at every level. And what Indigenous people want is right, self-determination, because we never gave up our rights to determine our own lives, right? Sorry, excuse me. When we go back to this time immemorial, when Indigenous people were, right, Indigenous knowledge, our system of government, our spiritual practices, our ways of taking care of each other, our ways of understanding what it means to live in relationship in a good way with each other and with the land, right? This is still a part of who we are. And we didn't give it up in the treaty process. And so this is what our communities are working for, self-determination. And we're making progress. There's a lot of work to be done. Like I said, our artists and educators and lawyers, we're working at it to create new and better relationships. But this this history, right? Understanding this history and how it came to be that we live in this current situation with, the impact of the residential schools, and understanding how the Indian Act has impacted our communities and really structured the relationship between First Nations people and non-First Nations people. We need to know this history so that we can contribute to new and better relationships. And as educators, right, this is our work, right? We weren't the teachers in residential schools, but education, it's our system, right? We are the educators. It's our responsibility to address this history and address this relationship. And that's that's the possibility, and that's the hope, right? And we need to know the history. We need to be able to get comfortable with the history so that we can teach it to our students. Because the students in your classrooms, they are the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren of residential school survivors, right? They're the descendants of our ancestors who signed treaties, right? They didn't sign those treaties for nothing, right? They signed those treaties because they were thinking about us, and they were thinking about the kids in your classrooms, the kids who would come, right? And they want and need, right, language and culture and knowledge, right? Or the knowledge of Indigenous people. All kids have right to access that knowledge, and all kids have the right to know these stories, and that's our responsibility.